John Strong, a wealthy widowed executive, saves Rosita Dominguez, his son's nanny and an immigrant, from deportation by pretending to be married to her. But everyone was shocked when, how far would someone go to protect their nanny, even if it means risking everything? Before we continue, tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching the video from. And don't forget to subscribe. John Strong stepped out of the sleek black car, the engine's soft hum fading into the background as he took a moment to gather himself. The air was crisp, tinged with the scent of pine from the trees that lined the driveway leading up to his grand home. It was an impressive estate, one that spoke of wealth and success, but today it felt hollow, echoing with the absence of laughter and warmth that had once filled its halls. The memories of his late wife lingered like shadows in every corner, a constant reminder of the life they had built together, now reduced to fragments of what used to be. With a heavy heart, John walked toward the entrance, the sound of his footsteps muted by the plush carpet that welcomed him home. The grand foyer, adorned with elegant chandeliers and polished marble floors, felt more like a museum than a home. He paused for a moment, allowing himself to be enveloped by the silence, the weight of his grief pressing down on him. But today, there was something else awaiting him, a source of light amid his darkness. As he opened the door to the living room, he caught sight of Lucas, his young son, who was sitting on the floor, engrossed in a colorful puzzle. The boy's brow was furrowed in concentration, his little fingers deftly fitting the pieces together. John's heart swelled with affection. Lucas was the embodiment of his late wife, a living reminder of the love they had shared. But before he could take another step, a burst of movement caught his attention. Rosita Dominguez, their devoted caregiver, entered the room with a gentle grace that seemed to light up the space. The warmth in her demeanor was palpable, a stark contrast to the coldness that often surrounded John. She was a young immigrant, her life marked by vulnerability, yet she exuded a strength that captivated those around her. The way she cared for Lucas was nothing short of remarkable. She had become not just a caregiver but a surrogate mother in many ways. At that moment, Lucas looked up, his face breaking into a wide grin as he spotted John. He scrambled to his feet and ran towards Rosita, who knelt down to embrace him. The sight of them together brought a rare smile to John's lips. Rosita wrapped her arms around Lucas, lifting him effortlessly as if he were weightless, her laughter ringing through the air like a sweet melody. They shared a moment of pure joy, a connection that spoke of trust and love, and for a fleeting second, John felt the heaviness of his grief lift. As they embraced, a pang of longing surged through John's chest. He had always admired Rosita for her unwavering dedication to Lucas. Her patience and kindness had created a safe haven for the boy, who, at times, seemed lost in the shadow of his father's sorrow. But John also felt an inexplicable connection to Rosita that he couldn't quite understand. It was a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, an emotion that stirred within him, complicating the boundaries of their relationship. Dinner that evening was a simple affair, a meal prepared with care by Rosita. The three of them gathered around the table, the soft glow of candlelight casting flickering shadows on the walls. Lucas chattered away, his excitement palpable as he recounted stories from his day, animatedly gesturing as if he were the star of a grand production. John listened, his heart warmed by the sound of his son's laughter, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Rosita sat across from them, her smile faltering for just a moment as her phone vibrated on the table. John noticed the way her fingers lingered over the device, her expression shifting from cheerful to anxious. She glanced at the screen, and for a heartbeat, John felt the atmosphere in the room change. It was subtle, but he could sense the weight of her concern, the tension that crept into her posture as she answered the call. He watched as Rosita's eyes widened, her voice barely a whisper as she spoke to her immigration attorney. John's heart raced, and he felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The conversation, although muted, was heavy with implications. The anxiety radiating off Rosita was palpable, and Lucas, sensing the shift, paused mid-bite, his innocent eyes darting between them. The warmth of the room suddenly felt stifling, the laughter and joy replaced by an unspoken dread. When the call ended, Rosita's gaze fell to her plate, the color draining from her face. John could see the turmoil brewing within her, the fear that threatened to consume her. He felt a surge of protectiveness rising within him, a desire to shield her from whatever storm was brewing on the horizon. But what could he do? He was still grappling with his own grief and the responsibilities of being a single father. As the evening wore on, John's mind raced. He could sense the urgency in Rosita's demeanor, the way she seemed lost in thought even as she forced a smile for Lucas. He wanted to reach out, to ask her what was wrong, but the words caught in his throat. The idea of crossing that line felt daunting, especially considering the fragile bond they had forged. He was a wealthy widower, and she was an immigrant, caught in a precarious situation, one that could unravel everything they had built together for Lucas. Later that night, as he lay in bed, the darkness pressing in on him, John replayed the events of the evening in his mind. He thought of Rosita, her anxious expression, and the weight of the phone call that had altered the atmosphere of their dinner. The thought of her being in danger sent a chill down his spine. He couldn't let her go. She was a lifeline for Lucas, a source of comfort and stability in a world that felt increasingly chaotic. As the hours passed, sleep eluded him. John's thoughts spiraled, and he found himself contemplating a plan, a way to protect Rosita from whatever was looming over her. He felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility, not just for her, but for Lucas as well. If there was a chance that Rosita could be taken away from them, he knew he had to act. The next morning, a sense of determination filled John as he made his way downstairs. He found Rosita in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for Lucas. The sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating her features, casting a warm glow around her. She looked up, her expression softening as their eyes met, but there was still a flicker of worry hiding behind her smile. John took a deep breath, ready to confront the reality of the situation. He needed to know what was happening, to understand the threat looming over Rosita, but at the same time, he felt an unexpected surge of affection for her. It was complicated, this mix of emotions, gratitude, protectiveness, and something deeper that he had yet to fully acknowledge. As they sat together, the clatter of dishes and the sound of Lucas's laughter filling the air, John knew that a decision had to be made. The stakes were high, and the future felt uncertain, but he was willing to do whatever it took to safeguard the fragile world they had created together, even if it meant venturing into uncharted territory. In that moment, he realized that their lives were intertwined, and to protect Rosita, he would need to make a bold choice, one that would change the course of their lives forever. The air in John Strong's grand home was thick with unspoken tension as Rosita Dominguez mulled over John's unexpected proposal. She stood in the kitchen, her hands resting on the cool marble countertop, staring into the distance as the reality of her situation sank in. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the room and casting soft shadows that danced along the walls. It was a beautiful day outside, but inside her heart was heavy. The thought of becoming part of a charade, a marriage of convenience, was almost unfathomable, yet the alternative was far worse. Deportation and separation from Lucas, the boy she had come to love as if he were her own. Rosita took a deep breath, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions swirling within her. She thought of Lucas, his bright smile and innocent laughter, and how her absence would shatter his world. The bond they shared had grown over countless afternoons spent playing in the backyard, reading stories before bedtime, and comforting him through the loss of his mother. The idea of leaving him behind was unbearable. As much as the thought of a fake marriage sent tremors of uncertainty through her, it was a lifeline. John watched her, concern etched across his features. He could see the conflict in her eyes, the way they flickered with fear and confusion. He knew that his proposal was unconventional, even reckless, but the thought of losing Rosita and the stability she provided for Lucas was equally as terrifying. The weight of his wealth and privilege felt heavy on his shoulders. It had never before felt like a burden until now. He had built a life of comfort for himself and his son, yet here was a woman who had sacrificed her safety and well-being for them, and he was utterly unprepared for the depth of his feelings for her. As Rosita finally turned to face him, her expression softened. She recognized the sincerity in John's eyes, the earnestness of his offer. It was not merely a transaction but an act of kindness, one that would change both their lives. After a moment, she nodded slowly, the decision crystallizing in her mind. While it felt like stepping into uncharted waters, she understood it was the only way forward. The days that followed were filled with a flurry of activity as they began to navigate the complexities of their new arrangement. The once clear boundaries of their relationship blurred, and they found themselves learning to coexist in a manner that felt oddly domestic. Rosita moved her few belongings into the guest room, and John made subtle adjustments to his routine to accommodate her presence. The house, which had felt so vast and empty since his wife's passing, began to pulse with life again. John noticed how swiftly Lucas adapted to the changes, his laughter echoing through the halls as he and Rosita built forts out of cushions or danced in the living room to their favorite songs. Seeing them together brought a warmth to John's heart that he hadn't felt in years. He marveled at Rosita's patience and her ability to connect with Lucas, bringing out sides of him that had long been dormant. She was a nurturing force, and with each passing day, John felt an inexplicable draw to her strength and kindness. As the weeks passed, the facade of their relationship deepened. John often found himself stealing glances at Rosita when she was unaware, admiring the way she moved with grace, the way she laughed freely with Lucas, and the way she took care of minor details that seemed to slip through his fingers. They shared meals, laughter, and moments of quiet companionship that made the pretense feel more like reality. Yet, underlying it all was an unspoken tension, a fragility that loomed over them like a shadow. One evening, after a particularly joyous day filled with laughter and games, they found themselves alone in the living room. The golden light from the setting sun spilled through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room. John was sitting on the couch, a book in hand, while Rosita tidied up the space around them. She moved with an effortless grace, her hair catching the light and framing her face in a gentle halo. John's heart raced as he watched her, a wave of admiration washing over him. He felt a pull, an urge to bridge the distance that still lingered between them. It was in that moment that he realized how much she meant to him, not just as Lucas's caregiver, but as a person, a confidant. The thought of their arrangement transforming into something more sent a thrill through him, yet the weight of reality quickly pulled him back. They were still bound by circumstance, by the deception that had brought them together. As Rosita turned to him, a flicker of something passed between them, a shared understanding, an acknowledgement of the complicated emotions brewing just beneath the surface. The air felt charged, thick with potential and unsaid words. It was a fleeting moment, but one that sent John's heart racing. He could see it in her eyes. She felt it too. Yet, as quickly as it ignited, they both stepped back, pushing the feelings aside, burying them beneath layers of obligation and fear. Rosita resumed her task, the moment dissipating like mist in the morning sun. John returned to his book, but the words blurred together as his mind raced with thoughts of her. He struggled to maintain the pretense, to remind himself of the boundaries they had established. Still, a part of him yearned for something deeper, something more authentic than the charade they were living. He wanted to tell her how he felt, to explore the connection that was blossoming between them, but the fear of what that could mean for both of them held him back. Later that night, as they settled into their separate routines, John lay awake in bed, the silence of the house amplifying his thoughts. He reflected on how their lives had intertwined so quickly, how the lines between convenience and genuine affection had blurred. He couldn't deny the warmth that filled the spaces between them, the comfort of shared laughter and quiet moments. But he also couldn't ignore the reality of their situation, the precariousness of Rosita's immigration status and the looming threat of separation. In the days that followed, John fought against the rising tide of emotions. He threw himself into work, attempting to distract himself from the deepening feelings for Rosita. But every time he returned home to find her with Lucas, joy radiating from her every action, the walls he had built around his heart began to crack. The truth of their situation loomed ever closer, and John felt an urgency to confront it, to address the feelings that were threatening to overflow. But for now, they continued to navigate this delicate dance, each of them grappling with the complexities of their intertwined lives. Rosita remained steadfast in her role, her heart aching with the realization that their connection was becoming something profound. She cherished every moment with Lucas and Jon, yet the fear of what lay ahead loomed like a dark cloud. As they moved forward, the question hung in the air. Could this arrangement evolve into something more, or were they destined to remain trapped in a web of convenience? And so they went on, each day a blend of laughter and unspoken feelings, a facade that felt more real with each passing moment, yet still tethered to the precarious nature of their reality. As the weeks rolled into a rhythm of carefully curated normalcy, Jon and Rosita found themselves entwined in a facade that was becoming increasingly intricate. The social events they attended were a blend of elegance and scrutiny, where the eyes of friends, acquaintances, and the occasional curious stranger scrutinized their every interaction. They donned their roles as husband and wife with a practiced ease, exchanging smiles and whispers that spoke of a union deeper than mere pretense, even if both were too cautious to acknowledge it openly. One evening, they attended a charity gala at one of the city's most prestigious venues, a sprawling estate adorned with twinkling fairy lights and the soft glow of chandeliers. The air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers and the sound of laughter mingling with classical music played by a live string quartet. Jon, dressed in a tailored suit that accentuated his tall, broad-shouldered frame, stood beside Rosita, who illuminated the room in a flowing teal gown that accentuated her graceful silhouette. Her hair fell in soft waves, framing her face, which now held a blend of confidence and vulnerability that Jon found utterly captivating. As they moved through the crowd, Jon kept a protective arm around Rosita's waist, a gesture that had become second nature to him. Each touch, each glance lingered just a moment longer than necessary, igniting a tension that neither fully understood nor dared to explore. Conversations swirled around them, filled with pleasantries and small talk, but as the evening progressed, they found themselves increasingly isolated from the world beyond their shared bubble. They laughed at jokes, exchanged knowing looks, and played their parts so well that even Jon began to persuade himself that there might be a flicker of something real between them. However, as the evening wore on, the pretense of their relationship presented its own challenges. At the height of a jovial toast, they were approached by a group of friends who engaged them with a flurry of questions about their life together. Jon felt a knot forming in his stomach as the inquiries turned more personal, each one probing deeper into the fabricated narrative they had spun. Rosita, noticing the shift in Jon's demeanor, instinctively leaned closer, her presence steadying him. He could feel her warmth radiating, a silent reassurance that they were in this together, even if it was a game they were forced to play. As the night deepened, Jon and Rosita found themselves alone on a terrace adorned with blooming roses and the soft glow of lanterns. The stars twinkled above them, a celestial audience to their quiet moment. The sounds of the party faded into the background, and in the stillness, a palpable tension filled the air. Jon turned to Rosita, his heart racing as he caught her gaze. In that instant, they were no longer merely acting. They were two souls caught in a web of unspoken emotions that had been building since their lives had intertwined. Without thinking, Jon leaned in closer, drawn by an inexplicable force. Their lips met in a tentative kiss, soft and hesitant at first, as if testing the waters of a new reality. Time seemed to stand still, and for a fleeting moment, the world around them vanished. But just as swiftly as it had begun, the kiss ended, leaving them both breathless and wide-eyed with shock. They stepped back, the reality of their situation crashing over them like a tidal wave. In the aftermath of that stolen moment, both were overwhelmed by conflicting emotions. Jon felt a surge of warmth that spread through him, igniting a spark of hope he hadn't realized he longed for. But alongside that warmth was a wave of confusion and fear, a realization that their arrangement was meant to be a shield, not a path to deeper entanglements. Rosita, too, was caught in a storm of feelings, an intoxicating mixture of excitement and dread. They both understood that this kiss was a pivotal moment, one that could shatter the delicate balance they had maintained. Rosita's thoughts spiraled as she considered the precariousness of their situation. She reminded herself of the reasons they had embarked on this path: the protection it offered her, the safety of Lucas, the very fabric of their existence that depended on keeping up appearances. If they allowed their feelings to guide them, what would happen to that fragile stability? Would John still be willing to protect her if he knew the depths of her history? The weight of her past loomed like a specter, urging her to retreat behind the walls she had meticulously built. Determined to regain some semblance of control, she suggested they focus on Lucas. The little boy had become a bright spot in their lives, an innocent thread weaving them together. He was a reminder of the love that could flourish in unexpected places, and they both cherished the joy he brought. Rosita's heart swelled at the thought of him, and she knew that whatever else happened between her and John, Lucas would always be their priority. Days passed, and the kiss remained unspoken, a secret tucked away beneath layers of their daily lives. They continued to attend events, navigate social situations, and manage the day-to-day challenges of raising Lucas. But the tension that had sparked that evening lingered, a constant undercurrent that added an unnameable depth to their interactions. Each time their hands brushed or their eyes met, a spark ignited, a reminder of the boundaries they had crossed and the new territory they were now treading. Yet, as they settled into this uneasy equilibrium, shadows from Rosita's past began to encroach upon her carefully constructed life. One afternoon, as she was arranging flowers in the living room, she heard a knock at the door. The sound echoed ominously in the quiet space, making her heart race with apprehension. She opened the door to find an unexpected face from her past, a man whose presence sent a jolt of fear through her. He was someone she had known back home, a figure entwined with memories she had fought hard to escape. His eyes held a glint of something dangerous, a reminder of the life she had left behind, and she instinctively stepped back, her mind racing with the implications of this encounter. He greeted her with a smile that felt more like a threat than a welcome, and she could sense the weight of his expectations pressing down on her. His presence was a stark reminder of the vulnerabilities she had thought she had outrun. He wasted no time in laying out his demands, outlining a dubious scheme that would require her assistance. The threat hung in the air, unspoken yet clear. If she didn't comply, he would expose her immigration status, shattering the fragile life she had built with John and Lucas. Panic surged through Rosita, and with it came the realization that her carefully constructed world was teetering on the edge of collapse. She felt the ground beneath her shift as she faced this old acquaintance, a reminder that the past could never truly be buried. The weight of her choices pressed down on her, and she knew she would have to make a decision, one that could either safeguard her newfound family or plunge them all into chaos. As she stood there, the shadows of her past swirling around her, she understood that the path ahead would not be easy. The stakes had never been higher, and she felt the walls beginning to close in. With every beat of her heart, she realized that whatever decision she made next would define not only her future, but also the delicate bond she had formed with John. The contours of their lives were shifting, and she could only hope that they were strong enough to weather the storm that was about to break. John stood in the spacious living room, the sunlight streaming through the large bay windows, casting soft patterns on the polished hardwood floor. The atmosphere felt heavy, a stark contrast to the warmth of the day outside. He had just returned from a taxing meeting that had left him more drained than usual. His thoughts were consumed not only by the burdens of his business, but also by the complexities of his new life with Rosita and Lucas. The weight of the world seemed to press down on him, and the walls of his luxurious home felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. In the corner, he spotted Rosita, her delicate figure hunched over the kitchen island. She was preparing lunch for Lucas, who was sitting at the table, coloring with intense focus, oblivious to the world around him. John watched Rosita for a moment, noting the way her hair fell in soft waves around her face, the way she moved with a grace that belied her struggles. There was something so beautiful about her resilience, the way she had stepped into their lives and made herself indispensable, not just to Lucas, but to him as well. Yet today, the air was thick with unspoken words, and John could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. Rosita had been distant lately, her laughter less frequent, her smiles more fleeting. He had noticed the way her eyes would sometimes dart away when he tried to engage her in conversation, as if she were hiding behind an invisible wall. Concern twisted in his chest. He knew that her anxiety about her immigration status weighed heavily on her, but he didn't know how to breach the subject without causing further distress. As he approached the kitchen, he caught the faint scent of cilantro and garlic wafting through the air, grounding him momentarily in the comforting familiarity of their makeshift family routine. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, the sound of his phone vibrating on the counter interrupted him. The screen flashed Rosita's attorney's name, and his heart sank. He had no doubt that the call would only serve to heighten the tension between them. Rosita looked up, her eyes widening with apprehension as she saw the name on the screen. Jon hesitated, the weight of their unspoken agreement hanging heavily in the air. He could feel her fear radiating from her, and it tightened around him like a vice. He answered the call, listening intently. As the attorney spoke, Jon's grip on the phone tightened, and he felt a surge of anger and protectiveness. The details of the situation were grim, and a sense of urgency washed over him. Rosita was facing a deadline, and if they didn't act soon, she could be lost to them forever. After ending the call, Jon turned to Rosita, whose expression had shifted from apprehension to a flicker of hope as she read his face. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he needed to say. He approached her, the distance between them feeling monumental. He could see the weight of uncertainty in her eyes, and that unsettled him even more. He needed her to know that she was not alone in this fight. He spoke to her, his voice steady but gentle, outlining the steps they could take together. He assured her that he would stand by her side, that they would face whatever came next as a team. The words flowed from him like a river, each promise anchoring them closer together. He watched as her shoulders relaxed slightly, the tension easing from her brow. In that moment, they were united by a shared purpose, a resolve to navigate the storm that threatened to engulf them. But as they mapped out their strategy, Jon couldn't shake the troubling thought that gnawed at him. He was falling for Rosita, and the very foundation of their arrangement was precarious. How could he dare to hope for something more when their lives were entangled in a web of deceit? The idea that their relationship could transform into something real terrified him. The stakes were too high, and the fear of losing her overwhelmed him. Days turned into nights, and as they worked together, Jon found himself drawn to Rosita's spirit. He marveled at her tenacity as she tackled the challenges of her situation, often putting Lucas's needs before her own. Watching her interact with his son filled him with admiration. They had formed an unbreakable bond that he had never anticipated. Lucas adored her, and Jon couldn't deny that she had brought joy back into their lives in ways he had thought impossible. Yet, as the pressures of Rosita's situation mounted, Jon's admiration morphed into something deeper. He found himself stealing glances at her when she was unaware, his heart racing at the realization of how much she meant to him. Each laugh they shared, each tender moment, ignited a longing in him that he couldn't ignore. But the fear of what their relationship truly meant loomed over him like a dark cloud. What if she discovered the depths of his feelings? What if their arrangement fell apart, and he lost her completely? One evening, after a long day of strategizing and worrying, Jon and Rosita sat side by side on the couch, Lucas asleep in his bedroom. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated the room, casting a warm light that felt like a refuge from the world outside. They had just finished reviewing some documents, but the conversation had drifted away from legalities and into more personal territory. Jon found himself sharing a story from his childhood, an anecdote that made Rosita giggle, and in that moment, he felt a spark. A connection that was undeniable yet frightening. As Rosita leaned closer, her laughter fading into a soft smile, Jon caught a glimpse of vulnerability in her eyes. It was a reminder of the precariousness of their situation, of the walls they had built around themselves. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. He could feel the energy between them shifting, intensifying. But before he could respond, the moment slipped away, and they both turned their gazes to the floor, the air thick with unspoken words. Meanwhile, the shadows of Rosita's past began to creep into their lives once more. An old acquaintance had resurfaced, threatening to unravel everything they had built. Jon sensed the change in Rosita's demeanor, the way her laughter faltered, the way her eyes clouded with worry. It was clear that the pressure was mounting, and Jon felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. He wanted to shield her from the storm that loomed on the horizon, but he was powerless against the tides of her past. Rosita's acquaintance began to push her into a corner, leveraging her fears against her. Jon noticed the small, almost imperceptible changes in her behavior. She became more withdrawn, her laughter replaced by a haunted look that tugged at his heart. The walls that had once felt like a fortress began to feel like a prison, closing in on them both. The tension built until it reached a breaking point. Jon confronted Rosita one evening, the shadows of the room mirroring the uncertainty that loomed between them. He needed her to trust him, to open up about what was happening. But she hesitated, the fear etched in her features. Jon's heart ached at the thought of her suffering in silence, of carrying the weight of her past alone. He felt a desperate need to protect her, to fight for her. But he also recognized the vulnerability that lay beneath her guarded exterior. As the days passed, the threat from her acquaintance grew more pronounced, and Jon could see the toll it was taking on Rosita. The light that had once shone so brightly in her eyes began to dim, and it pained him to see her retreating into herself. He could feel the distance growing, and it terrified him. Determined to confront the issue head-on, Jon sought to reassure her, to let her know that they were in this together. He wanted her to see that she didn't have to face the darkness alone. But as he reached out to her, he sensed her walls solidifying once more. The fear of losing her, of watching her slip away, gnawed at him relentlessly. The stakes had never felt higher, and the uncertainty of their arrangement loomed like a specter, threatening to shatter the fragile peace they had begun to construct. In the midst of it all, Jon found himself grappling with a truth he could no longer ignore. He loved Rosita. But with that love came the realization that their lives were intricately tangled in a web of deception and vulnerability. As they moved through the challenges ahead, Jon knew that the path would not be easy, and he feared that the truth of their situation would test the very foundation of their bond. The thought lingered in his mind as he prepared for the trials that lay ahead, knowing that the choices they made now would shape their futures forever. In the soft light of the late afternoon, the atmosphere in the strong household felt charged with a mix of tension and vulnerability. Jon Strong stood by the large bay window of the living room, looking out at the sprawling garden where Lucas played with his toys, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the threshold of their home. The fading sunlight cast warm hues around the room, yet it did little to dispel the chill that had settled in Jon's heart. He turned slowly, his gaze landing on Rosita, who was seated on the couch with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes cast down as if she were weighing a great burden. It had been days since Rosita had shared the weight of her past with him, and the memory of that moment lingered in Jon's mind like a haunting refrain. He had sensed the fear and pain that had been etched into her features, the shadows of her experiences creeping into their daily lives. The love he had started to feel for her was now mingled with an overwhelming desire to protect her at all costs. As she sat there, lost in thought, he could see the flicker of anxiety in her eyes, her mind racing with unspoken fears. Rosita's vulnerability was palpable, and Jon felt a rush of empathy swell within him. He approached her gently, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. The small gesture elicited a slight shiver from her, and she finally met his gaze, her dark eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. It was in that moment that Jon realized how intertwined their lives had become, how deeply he had come to care for this woman who had entered their home as a stranger but had become an irreplaceable part of their family. The evening stretched on, and as the shadows deepened, Rosita moved about the kitchen, preparing dinner with a grace that belied the turmoil within her. Jon watched her from the doorway, captivated by the way she moved, her hands deftly chopping vegetables, her brow furrowed in concentration. He admired her strength, the way she carried herself despite the weight of her past. The aroma of garlic and onions filled the air, creating a warm and inviting atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the uncertainty that loomed over them. After dinner, they settled into the living room, the flickering light of the fireplace casting playful shadows on the walls. Lucas had been tucked into bed, his soft snores drifting through the house like a lullaby. Jon and Rosita sat across from each other, the distance between them seeming to shrink with each passing moment. The conversation flowed easily, Yet there was an unspoken tension lingering beneath the surface, a sense of urgency that both felt but did not address. In a moment of quiet stillness, Rosita's expression shifted. She hesitated before speaking, her voice barely above a whisper as she began to recount the events that had led her to leave her homeland. Jon leaned in, fully engaged, his heart racing as she shared her story. She spoke of the chaos that engulfed her country, the violence and fear that had driven her from the only place she had ever known. Memories flooded back to her, and Jon could see the pain etched in her features as she recounted the loss of her family, the uncertainty that had become her constant companion. As she spoke, Jon felt a profound connection to her, a thread of understanding weaving between them. He recognized the courage it took for her to share such intimate details, and his heart ached for the pain she had endured. With each word, he felt his admiration for her deepen, transforming into a fierce determination to protect her from the very forces that had torn her away from her home. The weight of her trauma settled heavily on his shoulders, and he vowed to do everything in his power to keep her safe. But just as the air seemed to grow lighter, a loud knock echoed through the house, shattering the fragile moment they had shared. Both Jon and Rosita froze, their expressions shifting from warmth to apprehension. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and Jon's heart sank as he sensed the impending dread. He exchanged a worried glance with Rosita, who had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. Jon rushed to the door, his mind racing with possibilities. As he opened it, the sight before him sent shockwaves through his body. Two immigration officials stood on the doorstep, their expressions stern and unyielding. The gravity of the situation hit him like a punch to the gut. They had come for Rosita. "Is Rosita Dominguez here?" one of the officials asked, his voice devoid of compassion. Jon felt a surge of protectiveness rise within him, a primal instinct to shield Rosita from the reality of her circumstances. He glanced back at her, and the look of terror in her eyes fueled his resolve. Rosita stood behind him, a deer caught in headlights, her body trembling as she took a step forward. The officials wasted no time, informing her of the tip they had received regarding her status. Jon felt a whirlwind of emotions, anger, fear, helplessness, crashing over him as he realized how quickly everything was spiraling out of control. The officials exchanged glances, their determination unwavering. Jon felt the ground shift beneath him as he attempted to reason with them, to plead for Rosita's release. He spoke fervently, trying to convey the truth of their situation, the love that had blossomed in the midst of chaos, but his words fell on deaf ears. The officials remained resolute, their duty overshadowing any semblance of empathy. As they moved to take Rosita away, Jon felt the weight of despair settle heavily in his chest. He reached out, desperate to hold on to her, to fight against the tide that was pulling her from him. But it was futile. The officials were unyielding, their hands firm as they guided Rosita toward the door. In that moment, time seemed to slow, and Jon felt a rush of sorrow wash over him. He watched helplessly as Rosita was led away, her frightened eyes locked onto his, a silent plea for understanding and support. The world around him faded, and all that remained was the heart-wrenching sight of the woman he had come to love being taken from him. With a final, lingering look, Rosita was gone, and Jon stood alone in the doorway, the echoes of her departure reverberating through the empty space of the house. The warmth of the fire seemed to dim, and the shadows grew longer, wrapping around him like a shroud. He felt a profound sense of loss, a gaping void where their shared moments had once flourished. The walls of their home, once filled with laughter and love, now felt cold and unforgiving. As the door closed behind Rosita, Jon was left grappling with the realization that the fight for her freedom had only just begun. In that moment of profound loss, he knew he would do whatever it took to bring her back, to confront the forces that had torn them apart. The love that had blossomed between them was worth fighting for, and he was determined to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Jon Strong sat in his opulent study, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The elegant room, adorned with rich mahogany furniture and soft, ambient lighting, felt suffocating in the wake of recent events. His thoughts were a chaotic whirlwind, consumed by the fear of losing Rosita. After the harrowing experience of seeing her taken away by immigration authorities, he knew he needed to act swiftly. The clock was ticking, and every second felt like a lifetime as he contemplated the reality of her situation. Gathering his resolve, John began to sift through the clutter on his desk. His fingers brushed against documents that detailed their marriage, papers filled with promises made under the guise of necessity. Although the arrangement had started as a mere convenience, it had transformed into something far more significant. He recalled the way Rosita had cared for Lucas, bringing light back into their lives after the loss of his wife. Suddenly, he felt the urgency to prove that their bond was genuine, that it had grown into something beautiful amidst the chaos. John meticulously organized the evidence he had gathered: photographs of family outings, notes from their heartfelt conversations, and testimonials from friends and colleagues who had witnessed their connection. Each piece represented a fragment of their shared life, a testament to the love that had blossomed beneath the surface. As he compiled the materials, he envisioned the courtroom, filled with the tension of the impending hearing. He could almost hear the gavel striking, marking the beginning of a battle that would determine Rosita's future. The next day, John arrived at the courthouse, his heart racing. The stark contrast between the gleaming marble floors and the somber atmosphere weighed heavily on him. He took a deep breath, reminding himself of the stakes. Rosita had become an integral part of his life, and he could not let fear dictate the outcome of their story. He found a seat in the courtroom, where the air was thick with anticipation. The judge entered, and silence fell over the room as he took his place. As the proceedings began, John sat rigidly, his mind racing with thoughts of Rosita. He could picture her, vulnerable and scared, waiting for justice. The attorney representing the government presented a case focused on Rosita's immigration status, highlighting her past and the supposed reasons for her deportation. John listened intently, his heart breaking at the portrayal of the woman he had come to love. He felt a surge of anger and protectiveness rising within him, pushing him to stand up for her. When it was finally his turn to speak, John stood, the weight of the moment settling on his shoulders. He cleared his throat, feeling the eyes of the courtroom on him. He began to recount the story of their relationship, how they had met, the challenges they had faced together, and the undeniable bond that had formed between them. He painted a picture of a family, emphasizing how Rosita had become a mother figure to Lucas, filling a void that had been left by tragedy. His voice trembled with emotion as he spoke, and he could see the judge's gaze shift, reflecting a growing interest. John continued, detailing the love and respect they had cultivated through their arrangement. He spoke of late-night conversations, shared dreams, and the laughter that echoed through their home. With each word, he fought to break down the barriers that defined their relationship as a mere facade. He described the moments that had changed everything: the times Rosita had comforted Lucas when he was upset, the way she had brought joy into their lives, and how she had inspired him to open his heart again. As he spoke, he could feel the tears brimming in his eyes, but he fought to hold them back, channeling his emotions into his words. The judge listened intently, and for a moment, the room was silent except for John's voice. He could sense a shift in the atmosphere, a growing understanding of the depth of their relationship. John concluded his testimony with a heartfelt declaration of his love for Rosita. He spoke of the dangers she faced if sent back to her home country, the persecution she had fled, and the uncertainty that hung over her life. He made it clear that their marriage was not just a legal arrangement but a reflection of their genuine feelings for one another. As he finished, John took his seat, his heart pounding. He had laid everything on the line, baring his soul for the world to see. The judge contemplated the case, and the tension in the room was palpable. John could feel the collective breath being held as everyone waited for the ruling. In that moment, he thought of Rosita, of the life they had built together, and the love that had blossomed amidst adversity. He hoped that the judge would see the truth of their connection, that it was more than mere convenience. It was a profound bond that had grown against all odds. Finally, the judge spoke, his voice steady and authoritative. He ruled in favor of Rosita, allowing her to remain in the country. Relief washed over John like a tidal wave, and his heart soared. He had fought for their love, and it had prevailed. As the gavel struck, marking the end of the hearing, John felt a sense of triumph mixed with the overwhelming anticipation of reuniting with Rosita. When she was brought into the courtroom, John's heart raced. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The world around them ceased to exist as he rushed toward her, their embrace filled with the weight of all they had endured. The warmth of her body against his was electric, a reconnection that felt as though they had been separated for an eternity. Just as they pulled apart, the doors swung open, and the commotion of police officers filled the room. John turned to see Rosita's old acquaintance being led away in handcuffs, his criminal activities finally exposed. Relief washed over John again as he realized that Rosita was free from the clutches of her past. In the following moments, as they stood together, John and Rosita exchanged glances filled with unspoken understanding. They had stepped through fire together, and now they emerged stronger than ever. The love that had grown between them was no longer just a product of circumstance. It had become a profound connection, a bond that would sustain them as they faced the future hand in hand. As they left the courthouse, the sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow around them. John took Rosita's hand, entwining their fingers, feeling the soft warmth of her skin against his. They walked into a new chapter of their lives, one marked by love, resilience, and the promise of a family that was truly their own.